The origins of Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas the Tank Engine is 50 years old. The stories were first created by the jelly clergyman, the Reverend Wilbert Audrey, as a way of entertaining his young son Christopher as he recovered in isolation from scarlet fever. Christopher demanded that he told the stories again and again, and the way of small children corrected his father whenever inconsistencies crept into the retold stories. In self-defense, the Reverend Audrey wrote the first stories down on available scraps of paper. To add to the storytelling, the Reverend Audrey drew simple pictures of steam locomotives on the paper along with the stories. A head-on view being the easiest to draw, he drew a row of locomotives standing in an engine shed with a human face and expressions on each locomotive's smoke box door. "Why is this engine sad, Daddy?" asked Christopher, pointing at an unhappy-faced locomotive. "Because he's old and tired and he hasn't been out in a long time," replied his father. "What is his name, Daddy?" Edward was the first name that came into the Reverend Audrey's mind. This was the genesis of Edward's Day Out, the first in almost 100 simple moral tales about the exploits and adventures of a group of railway engines given human personalities. Mrs. Audrey believed that these children's stories had some merit and so pestered her husband to do something about them. Through a distant cousin, a small publisher, Edmund Ward, was found who was interested in these railway stories. The connection was made so suddenly that the Reverend Audrey had to send the stories as they were written on scraps of paper as the original manuscript. Nevertheless, in 1945, the first of the railway series of books, The Three Railway Engines, appeared. This was a book small enough for children's hands, consisting of 3 stories, Edward's Day Out being the first. The book was laid out with the text on the left-hand page and a full-page illustration of an incident in the story on the right. Thomas the Tank Engine did not appear until the second book was published a year later in 1946, and more books followed at yearly intervals. The illustrator for the first dozen or so books was C. Reginald Dalby, who established the basic appearance of each locomotive character from the Reverend Audrey sketches and by looking at real steam engines in use in Britain at that time. Thus, an obscure 06OT Class E2 shunting engine built in the Victoria area for the London, Britain, and South Coast Railway became the model for Thomas, now known to millions of children worldwide. Gordon can be seen to be based on Gresley A3 Pacific from the London and Northeastern Railways, Flying Scotsman being the most famous real locomotive of this class. As the stories developed, the location and other features of fictional railway systems emerged. Many stories were based on actual happenings on Britain Railways and its predecessors. A railway locomotive did disappear down a mine shaft on the Furness Railway and get spun on a turntable by the wind. Midland Railway. More than one of the Reverend Audrey's clerical colleagues were just as fascinated as he with steam-powered machinery. The Reverend Terry Boston was as well-known collector of steamrollers and became the inspiration for the vicar who saves Trevor the traction engine from the scrap heap. More locomotive characters appeared, learning to deal with the troublesome trucks and to become really useful engines as they pulled their trains over the railway systems presided over by the steam but kindly fat controller Sir Topham Hats. The now famous engines all went to London and the Queen came to visit the railway. By the time the British Railways retired its last steam locomotive, the Reverend Audrey had firmly established the Island of Sodor as the location of his railway, happily unaffected by the modernization on the mainland. After 26 books, the Reverend Audrey laid down his pen, only to have it taken up by his son Christopher, who is now continuing to write stories for his son. 10 more books of the Railway series have now appeared so far under Christopher's name. Perhaps in turn, the Reverend Audrey's grandson will continue the tradition. During the 1960s, the Reverend Audrey built a model of Thomas's branch line and exhibited it at various model railway shows throughout England. It wasn't until 1984 that a whole new generation of children were introduced to Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends when the first of the TV series of that name was made. Gauge 1 models based on the Markler mechanisms were used in the making of the TV shows in a studio not far from Clapham Junction, Britain's busiest railway station. In response to the rekindled interest in Thomas, a British model railway manufacturer of Hornaby Railways introduced a number of 00 gauge models of the locomotives in the railway series. And that is the origins of Thomas the Tank Engine. I hope you enjoy it.